In the spring of 1399, King Richard II departed from England, setting sail for Ireland to deal with what he hoped would be a relatively straightforward problem. Travelling with the king was a 12-year-old boy called Henry of Monmouth. Henry was the son of Richard's cousin, now enemy, the exiled Henry Bolingbroke. Centuries on, Richard's Irish campaign looks, to put it mildly, ill-advised, and certainly those who witnessed the dramatic events of that year were at least of a similar opinion, with Richard said to be leaving England in a state of great disturbance. Just how disturbed England had become against their unpredictable and petty king would soon manifest itself. With Richard still preoccupied with his Irish campaign, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England, landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire on the 4th of July. Henry's father, the incredibly powerful John of Gaunt, had died a few months earlier, and now Henry had come to claim, out of Richard's thieving clutches, his inheritance of the Duchy of Lancaster. But Henry soon found out how much animosity had arisen against his cousin, and the situation for Henry became more fluid. What had started out for Henry as a mission to claim his rightful inheritance evolved into a scenario where he may now even think of claiming the English crown itself. On his landing at Ravenspur, Henry was greeted by many of the most powerful men in the north, including the Percy family, who would famously turn against Henry after he had become king. However, for the time being, the prevailing mood in the country was that Richard II and his evil counsellors must be removed from power. Not long after his homecoming, Bolingbroke found his army swelling to unlikely numbers, aided as he was by the powerful Percys. As more and more men flocked to his cause, the transformation from Henry thinking of only taking his Duchy of Lancaster to a full conquest of England would have happened fairly quickly. Richard could be a vindictive man, and Henry must have recognised the possibility that his life would have been in grave danger should his mission fail. With thousands of men now marching at his back, Henry realised the time had come to go on the attack. Inevitably, Richard was told of the events unfolding in England. Although it would have been deeply disturbing and unwelcome news for the king, it could hardly have been a surprise to him. As Richard's bitter reign dragged on, the king became steadily more unpopular, and he would realise the extent of his unpopularity and the resentment towards him when he crossed back over the Irish Sea, leaving Henry of Monmouth under guard at Trim Castle. Henry and his imposing army marched on Bristol Castle, where they seized three of Richard's leading men, William Scrope, the treasurer, John Bushy, and Henry Green, all three of whom were swiftly beheaded. As arrogant as he could be, even Richard couldn't fail to see which way the wind was blowing when he saw the size of the opposition army that was marching against him. Fleeing for his life, Richard retreated back into Wales, seeking refuge at Conwy Castle, and it was whilst he was there that Richard, having lost heart for the fight, attempted to negotiate with his enemies. Richard would eventually be taken prisoner by Henry at Flint Castle, never to be a free man again. Richard's downfall and Henry's rise to kingship would be confirmed in Parliament in the autumn of 1399. As Henry strode in, a huge cry went up, "Long live Henry of Lancaster, King of England!" As the formal process of deposing Richard continued, with a long list of accusations outlining the king's ineptitude, a rather brave, if perhaps foolhardy bishop named Thomas Merk spoke up in defence of Richard. Merk's words had little impact other than to ensure his own difficulties. He was arrested and imprisoned at St Albans, losing his bishopric of Carlisle in the process. Merk's actions, however, although too little too late for Richard, did show that the former king had inspired some loyalty. and this may have been of some comfort to him as Richard languished in the Tower of London. Eventually, the sentence against Richard was read aloud. Richard of England shall be sentenced to imprisonment in some royal castle, that he be given the best bread and meat that money can buy, and that if anyone attempt to rescue him by force, he will be the first to die. That royal castle that Richard will be held would be Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, and it would prove to be Richard's final home. Any promises of sparing the deposed king's life meant very little, and Richard would likely have been aware of this. Whilst Richard was clearly hated in many quarters, he also retained, as we've seen, the loyalty of others, and it would be such loyalty that ultimately proved to be Richard's death sentence. In January 1400, when Henry Bolingbroke had only been King Henry IV for a matter of 3 months, the Windsor plot arose, which saw a number of earls seeking to re-establish their once powerful positions. For these conspirators, the only way to reclaim power was to restore Richard II to the throne. The plot, of course, failed, and the ringleaders were executed, whilst Henry ordered Richard to be deprived of food until he eventually wasted away to a truly dismal death. At one time, Richard and Henry had been kinsmen. They were, after all, cousins, both born in the same year of 1367, and both had been inside the walls of the Tower of London as teenagers when the peasants' revolt erupted all around them. Richard and Henry had a lot in common, but that common ground was slowly eroded by Richard's style of kingship. He was arrogant and dismissive of Bolingbroke's and the other nobles' concerns with his government, and by 1387 tensions were already at an almost irreparable level. Bolingbroke and the Lords Appellant tried to redirect Richard's government by forcefully removing his most corrupt ministers, but this merely set them on a collision course with Richard, who, over the next decade or so, sought bloody revenge against the Lords Appellant. Richard was doomed to fail as king, but Henry IV was also destined for hardship. Deposing a king, righteous or otherwise, was a monumental move and one that created problems for the usurper. If Henry had deposed Richard, why then could Henry himself not be deposed? Although Henry would only rule for 14 years, it would nonetheless be a long reign full of plots and conspiracies. By the end of his reign, Henry was struggling terribly with leprosy, whilst his son, Henry of Monmouth, began to shine as a future leader. It is an irony that this younger Henry, soon to be Henry V, managed to show a more positive side of Richard II, who had treated him with kindness during his youth. Even during the height of the tensions with Henry Bolingbroke, Richard II accepted the younger Henry, just a child at the time, was entirely innocent in the matter, and so Richard treated Henry almost like a son. For all his flaws, Richard II did have a capability for kindness, especially with children. After he had become king, Henry V moved Richard II's body from King's Langley in Hertfordshire to the more suitable surroundings of Westminster Abbey, one final show of gratitude to the king who was destroyed by Henry V's father.